So I'm particularly glad to be here. I've long thought that in my writing about Concord, I should have said more about Carlisle. And then I realized that Carlisle in the 18th century wanted very little to do with Concord and kept trying to break free. So you are all here, presumably to tell me, please, let my people go. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and to do it seated and not from a professorial lecture. I called this talk in advance of putting it together, Concord's and Carlisle's Roads to Revolution. But it's pretty hard to tell about Carlisle's road to revolution, in good measure, because the people living in the north part of Concord did not have a venue or an outlet for a separate voice. And Concord, as part of the overlooking and slighting of Carlisle residents, future Carlisle residents, didn't elect many people from the north part of town to local office. As a result, it's hard to figure out whether the people in the north part of Concord were deeply engaged in the revolutionary movement, were slow to join in, or were militants. So I'm going to give you a speculation. And that is that the situation of people in the north part of Concord was analogous to that of people who lived in the district Menotomy that was incorporated within Cambridge in the late colonial period, the future town of Arlington. Menotomy, like the district of Carlisle, did not have any separate voice since it was always incorporated in elections for town officers for Cambridge. But in their case, I could figure out from Cambridge town committees that there were members from the Menotomy district, sometimes chairs of the committees, who wrote the most blistering anti-British statements that you can find. Whereas the center of Cambridge, besides hosting the notorious college and its faculty members, who were not so woke in those days, also provide residence for the inhabitants of Tory Row on Brattle Street. So you can see in the Cambridge records a kind of tension between the center, the wealthier and built-up part, and the outskirts, Menotomy. I suspect that insofar as people who lived in the area that was the district of Carlisle, insofar as they participated in Concord's politics, they probably pushed strongly as common farmers for resistance to Britain. That's my speculation, and I apologize for not having found the documents that your historians haven't found that would tell a different story. So let me tell you my story of Concord. That is, 50 years ago, I was finishing up the Minutemen and Their World, never anticipating that I would be around for and still talking about the book almost 50 years later. I feel a deep sympathy and identification with the old veterans of April 19th, 1775, who showed up at the Jubilee in 1825. That old codger. And so I think back to what animated me in writing the Minutemen and Their World. So I was in my late 20s, graduate student at Columbia University, still trying to crank out a PhD dissertation, which was going to be a social history of Concord, part of a movement that was known in those days as the New Social History, in which a number of us, styling ourselves as somehow radical historians, wanted to write history from the bottom up. History of the people who had been invisible, overlooked by historians. From black people, free and enslaved, Native people stories, common laborers, women's history, not just the great and dead white men, but a whole range of people. And I thought I wanted to get to be part of that. I was drawn to the idea of doing a community study. It was as if I would not join a commune at the end of the 1960s, but write about other people's communities. That had great appeal to me. Also, I was not entranced by the notion that history was just past politics, or maybe politics and wars. Not so much because there was, elite white men's stories, as that I just felt in an era of political alienation from Nixon and the war in Vietnam, that there had to be some deeper way to write about history, to make a connection with the past. Could you write about communities and families and churches and how people made a living, how they educated their children, how they worshipped, how they dealt with crises of illness, how they mourned the dead. And so I wanted to talk about those things. And that would turn out to serve me well in trying to write the Minutemen and Their World. So I was working away on the social history for a PhD dissertation, and I had the really unexciting title of Land, Population, and Society in Concord, Massachusetts. You could fall asleep just by finishing the name of the dissertation. But while I was working on it and living in Concord and borrowing into the records, friends would visit, and the bicentennial was approaching. So I kept taking them, not to Walden Pond, which I thought I was going to be doing, but more often than not, to Minuteman National Park, which I hadn't realized was really not much more than a decade old when I was, when I was working on my book. And as I took them to the Northbridge Visitors Headquarters, I would look at the diorama. How many of you have seen the diorama in that? Well, you have all these little figures under glass laid out. You've got the Patriot forces, the British forces, beautiful landscape. And everybody is there waiting for their moment for someone to announce fire so they can all go into motion. Instead, they're frozen forever in time, like the lovers in the ode of Grecian urn, held forever in stasis. And I realized that was the problem of writing the history of April 19th and of Concord and Carlisle and the Revolution. That is, people were interested in the single moment. It was as if, most of you are old enough to remember, Dan Rather and CBS News would flood the zone to cover the story of the outbreak of fighting. Stay one more day and then leave. But you never really knew what had led up to it, what was the place where it happened, and what were the consequences. So I got this idea that I would write the Minutemen and Their World and set in motion the people and the communities and the British forces to see how life in Concord, ongoing feuds and struggles, conflicts, pressures, problems, might have shaped the ways in which people responded to British policy, and how the coming of revolution and war in turn might have altered the town or not. Those are open questions. So, yeah. Thank you. That's my agent and director speaking. So, the idea was then put everybody in motion. And that I thought would be easy to do. Didn't we know the story of the Minutemen? It had been written so many times. What I would bring to it would be an account of farming and crafts and trade in the town center and church life and town meeting and so on. That would be new. And so with great confidence, I set aside my PhD dissertation for a time and went to work on what I thought would be a quickie book. And it was, actually, in that it took about 2.5 years to do. Compared to the Transcendentalists in Their World, also on sale here, which took about 40 years. I thought it would be easy to know Concord, after all, home of the Minutemen, must have been quick to resist British taxes and tyranny. And how could one doubt that? And so I went to the town records, thinking I'd quickly get the resolutions passed by Concord, see what they did to oppose British measures. First place you go, of course, is the Stamp Act, 1765. October 31st or so is the date it went into effect. And I had read in Lemuel Shattuck's History of Concord that the town had adopted a resolution, and from Shattuck's description, it sounded like the resolution pretty much repeated the Braintree Resolves written by John Adams. And the town clerk was directed to inscribe the resolution in the town minute book directly. So I go into the Concord Library, ask to see the transcripts of the town meeting, and I go right to the date of the meeting, nothing there. So I say, would it be possible for me to see the originals? Maybe they left it out and skipped it in transcribing. I looked, nothing there. So the town apparently took steps to oppose the Stamp Act. Oh, I should say, it did so a day or two before the Stamp Act went into effect, which would not have a lot of impact. And nothing there. The town clerk evidently ignored the directive to inscribe the resolution in the book. Well, Stamp Act is repealed by Britain, and the next year comes round in May to elect a new representative to the House. And the Sons of Liberty in Boston print a notice of the number of legislators who were all friends of the Stamp Act and cooperated with the royal governor in putting it into effect. One of the names on that list was a representative from Lincoln. Another representative on the list was Charles Prescott of Concord. Lincoln's representative, Chambers Russell, gets defeated, as do most of the men who were said to be friends of the Stamp Act. Charles Prescott of Concord is reelected. So you think, And the more I looked, the more I kept finding that Concord was either aloof from protests happening in Boston or elsewhere, or acted slowly, dragging their heels. And in the Minutemen and Their World, in the first version, you might think that, well, maybe they're too busy arguing among themselves to notice what's going on elsewhere. That might be, but there was a kind of... How many of you have been on committees of church or town? If you want to kill something, what do? Right. And how do you do it? Right. Or you postpone. So not enough people here, we need more research. And so time and again, so when the Tea Act is passed, and then the Mohawks of Boston dumped the tea into the harbor, a lot of towns some towns are passing resolutions like Lexington, associating themselves with the destruction of the tea. Concord doesn't get around to saying anything on the matter till a month and a half after you could get your tea from Boston Harbor. Concord never, ever endorsed the boycotts against British goods that Bostonians were spearheading in the period that leads up to the Boston Massacre. So you think, whoa, this is not the story I expected to see. It is only in the summer and fall of 1774 they Concord explodes in fury against British policies. And that is in the period of time when Britain has revoked the Massachusetts Charter of 1691, and Parliament has passed, with the King's approval, the Massachusetts Government Act, or as I now like to think of it, the first MAGA in Massachusetts history. The Massachusetts Government Act barred all town meetings, except the annual one to elect municipal officers, without the governor's advance approval. And he's got to see the agenda, the warrant, before approving. In addition, the council, the upper branch of the legislature, whose consent was needed on a whole lot of things, including using the military in Boston. That council had been chosen by the House of Representatives, so was in effect popularly elected, though the governor could reject names. That popular voice was taken out. In addition, all the judges, all the sheriffs, all the justices of the peace were hereafter to be appointed and paid by the crown, not by the legislature. So the one place for a voice for a town would be in the House of Representatives. You would not be able to call a town meeting with the purpose of denouncing British policies. That would have been considered and was considered now against the law. So it's when people are suddenly facing the denial of the right to govern themselves in their communities, which was really the fundamental focus of Massachusetts government, that's when everybody exploded. So why then? So the next part of this talk is going to talk about why then and how the social history interacts with it. So before I delve into the social history, I think we need to recognize that not just what you do and what you say that matters to the historian. It's also how you say it and how you do it. The language, the rhetoric that people use can often be an indicator of their militancy, moderation, and the like. Nobody was using the F word about British policies. But in the vernacular of the times, in the language of common farmers, you can see the militancy. But first we might say, Braintree resolves, like other resolutions that denounce Stamp Act, primarily concentrate on economic arguments and constitutional arguments. The economic arguments are pretty simple. These taxes will put a burden on trade. They'll undermine our economic growth. Poor people can't afford them. People will go hungry. It will also hurt you in Britain because we won't be able to do enough trade to pay for the goods we import. Well, you know, that's an argument that could be strong or weak, but doesn't particularly threaten the existing order. Linked to that could be a constitutional argument. Taxation without representation goes against the principles of the unwritten British Constitution and Magna Carta and the solutions to the crisis under Charles I and then leading to the Glorious Revolution. So again, but a lawyer can make those arguments. You don't have to be a patriot to make an economic argument or a constitutional argument. But there was a third argument that Lexington would make in response to the Stamp Act and then later things, but well before Massachusetts Government Act. Here's what Lexington had to say in late 1772. Our worthy ancestors, after many struggles with their enemies, in the face of every danger and at the expense of much treasure and blood, secured to themselves and transmitted to us, their posterity, a fair and rich inheritance, not only of a pleasant fertile land, but also of invaluable rights and privileges, both as men and Christians, as stated in the royal charter of this province, and secured to us by the faith of the British Crown and Kingdom. That's all one sentence. Having received so precious a legacy, it was their duty to protect and preserve it and pass it on intact to the next generation. That stands out in resolutions of towns, of ordinary farmers, often speaking, and in the county conventions held in August and September of 1774. And that language is particularly important because it invokes the sacrifices of the ancestors who fled the tyranny of Charles I and Archbishop Laud, of the established church, to risk their lives in the Atlantic crossing, make their way through what they thought of as the wilderness, struggle to live with or war against native peoples, all so they could establish civil and religious liberty for themselves and their posterity. That appeal to the ancestors is quite extraordinary, I think, and it is the sign of popular militancy. Because to go against your duty to the ancestors is to betray the whole history that led up to you. This is not an economic argument. It's not a constitutional argument. It's really an argument about collective identity, of who we are as New Englanders. In that case, is you might even see as a kind of tribal case, a version, if you will, of the ethnic nationalism that we can see as actually being pretty problematic in the 19th century and in our own world today. Think of the Serbs in their wars against the people breaking up from former Yugoslavia. The Serbs invoking that Battle of the Crows back in, was it 13th century, still putting a burden on them. So it's that language that stands out when the Massachusetts Government Act is passed, revoking the charter hard won by the Puritan forefathers. And in that setting, you can then see how you have the makings of a readiness to fight. That's not alone. How else you get to revolution? You get to revolution, I think, when you see the British actions not merely as wrong and even antithetical to the legacy of your ancestors, but as done not mistakenly but malevolently by the ministers of George III and his corrupt representatives in Massachusetts. They are engaged in a conspiracy against liberty to impose slavery on the colonists and people in Massachusetts to line their own pockets. They meant slavery not just by reference to the black people who were enslaved in Massachusetts and in Concord and in Carlisle, though in small numbers. They meant it also in that what slavery is exploiting someone's labor, the fruits of someone else's labor, for your own benefit. And in effect, that is, of course, what African slavery was, the exploitation of other people's labor, of black people's labor, unwilling labor for white benefit. So to say that they were faced with slavery isn't just rhetorical. It does have, your taxes are taking the fruit of your labor. So it wasn't just rhetorical. But to see a conspiracy further meant that you could connect the dots. That it wasn't just one law or another. They were all bound together in a cumulative plot. And what would you do about it? You need to coordinate with others. If you can coordinate with others, you're breaking out of the one town, one response framework and getting to mobilize. The problem here, as conservatives saw it, is that those who were complaining about the unconstitutionality of British taxes and enforcement measures were themselves engaged in unconstitutional acts. When they called on Massachusetts as a representative, as a legislature, to write a circular letter to all the other colonies to protest British measures, the conservatives said, whoever gave them the authority to do that? Nowhere in the Massachusetts Charter does it say the colony is empowered to communicate with other colonies, especially by communicating and not going straight to the Crown. And then there's the problem of committees of correspondence, which the Sons of Liberty in Boston initiated to get townspeople to talk over the lines of their borders, to communicate with one another about the outrages happening in Boston. But where does it say in any law of Massachusetts that towns are empowered to elect committees of correspondence? So the conservatives said, hey, you have a fine way to protest. Elect a representative to the legislature from Concord, or if you're in the district of Carlisle, ask Atkins who wants to elect one together, and give them instructions, and they can all discuss the matter and send to the king a humble petition asking for a redress of grievances. And I've come to realize that, thinking back to the 1960s, early 70s, when I was first conceiving the Minutemen and Their World, that the conservatives and the moderates were basically saying, you got to work within the system. The taxes might be bad, the war in Vietnam might be wrong, but you can't go through the streets demonstrating, breaking store windows. You've got to be legal and moderate and careful about it. So the people, some of whom would become loyalists, were more concerned about the disruption of order than they were about paying the taxes. Okay, so that gives you a sort of broad story. Now, why summer of 1774? I think the first thing we have to realize is that to engage in opposition to British authority and taxes, to take measures that are not in any constitution or law, and to break out in fury, refuse to accept the new regime Britain wishes to impose, to close the courts, stop them from meeting with popular crowds threatening violence against judges, by having groups meet on Concord Common and intimidate people who had accepted appointments to the new council and force them to resign, by treating people with threats of tar and feathering, or Duncan Ingram in Concord riding his coach to the center of town, discovering a sheep's head and offal was thrown on his coach. People's doors, fancy doors, were smeared with excrement. To do all these things unsettles authority, the very thing that the moderates and conservatives were concerned about. Revolution threatens all authority relationships. And so one of the striking things about Concord and Massachusetts is when they rise up, they're claiming that it's the British who have left the government, the governor's office, unfilled instead of following the Charter of 1691. So they can say it's the British who are undermining authority. So revolution unsettles authority, and it introduces into the local political culture challenges that go against the way people are accustomed to doing things. Here we have to realize that the political system, as much as it might have been concerned about liberty, was in fact still based upon an ideology of inequality. Think of John Winthrop speaking to the settlers on the way over in the Arbella and giving his lay sermon on a seat on a hill, in which he says this inequality is part of God's design for a good community. That some are born high and eminent in dignity, others mean, low and mean in subjection. Why is there inequality? God's intended it this way. Some have one set of abilities, another a different set. They'll need to cooperate to get by. So the inequality is the instrument of interdependence and a good community. Moreover, and these ideas stay on. Ministers were preaching down into the 1760s and 70s that just as there are hills and valleys, there's higher and lower in the political order. So not only is there inequality, but you're expected to pay deference to leading men, not just of wealth, but of age and experience. And the notion of inequality could be mapped onto the very seating arrangements in the meeting house. I noticed most of you, did you come in and have assigned seats? Did you all sit where you wanted? Phil didn't tell you where to sit? I know, there's the VIP section right up here. In 18th century Massachusetts, towns formally seated the meeting house. And everybody had a place. Committees were appointed to draw up the criteria by which people would be seated. Can you imagine that today? Trying to get a town committee to agree on even on the criteria, not to say who got to meet them. But basically in the Concord meeting plan, they interrupted their concern with British policies to say, no, we got to figure out who's sitting where in the meeting house. So you've got the minister up high, the high pulpit. Then you have the deacons staring out at you all, looking at who's laughing and smirking and not listening. And then in the first row, they would follow the principle. First go by age, then by wealth, then by community service. So everybody over 80 got to sit in the front. Then the rich 7-year-olds and the middling and poor 7-year-olds sat. Then the rich 60-year-olds, the middling 60-year-olds, the poor 60-year-olds, back to the 50-year-olds. Men on one side, women on the other. Women took the status of their husbands, or widows did. They were dependent variables, we might say. And everybody over 40 had to go up to the galleries. Black people did not have formal seats. They were put into the corners of the upper galleries. Out of sight, but not entirely out of mind. So this was a world of elders, which I wrote about, maybe even, might have been a little snarky when I was 30. Now, why can't we live in a world of elders? What's the problem with that? Nobody gets out of my way these days when I'm walking on the streets of the BD Center and a bunch of high school kids come by. I think, oh, bring back 18th century Concord. So, a world of elders. Selectmen's sons were highly likely to become selectmen. Men's clothing showed the valuation that was put on age. They wore, small clothes, waist wide, small clothes, and high knee stockings, so that they could show off their calves. The historian I know once described that as a man's last anatomical advantage. They would, and this went down to the early 19th century, when people lied about their age, they rounded up, not down. So a world of elders, which you deferred to age and experience, people who served the town for a long time. In Carlisle, whose name might be Blood or Wilkins, and their kids after them. So you've got a world of elders. But there's also a political culture that's associated with it. A culture that frowns on division and contention, seeks to bring about a consensus in town meeting. And that consensus is emphasized when often the town clerk will write in the book, the town voted unanimously or without disagreement. To achieve that ideal, you don't get together in political parties. You don't campaign for office. Why? Because where there's discord, there's every evil work. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Conflict is illegitimate. Everyone should aim to be of common mind with everyone else. But of course, conflict did in fact regularly take place. The ideal of consensus made it harder than ever to engage in what we take to be normal politics because they were aiming for something different. And that, as an aside, let me say, is part of what I wanted to get at in writing the Minutemen, to try to understand that the Minutemen were not the same as us, but in funny clothes. That maybe they had a different worldview. Maybe they understood liberty differently and politics differently from the way we do. And so you have this political culture aiming at unanimity and harmony. Oh, and one part of that is in the church, one town, one church, pay taxes for the minister and the meeting house. A church, if it was divided, could no longer hold a regular communion service. So a rift in the congregation would be a serious blow to congregational worship. So you have a world that also looks toward patriarchy and the control of families. A household, the Puritans and their descendants preached, was a little commonwealth. It was an arena in which you learned how to defer to authority. And what made patriarchy possible was control of land. Fathers with land that they could pass on to sons who would be willing to wait till their mid-20s or later to marry. Women who would be on average 20, 21, 22 years old, who were willing to wait despite the fact that they were long since ready for marriage, because they knew they would get the land in turn. And when that was the case, they could stick around so long as the fathers had an abundance of land. That's how you get little neighborhoods of Buttricks and Barretts, of Clarks, on this Rook Road, all over Concord and the Massachusetts countryside. In that instance, you also see how people look toward the collectivity and how they name their children. So fathers would name the first son typically for themselves or the first daughter for the mother. And then they would start going through the genealogy of the family. As land would become short, it became very popular to give children the names or middle names for uncles who never married and had land. We want to honor you. Could you honor our son? And in addition, you can really see the values in that if a child died, they would replace the name by giving it to the next child of the same sex. Now, if I told you that my wife Ann and I, we have 3 children, and our oldest is Matthew. If he had died and when the next one came along, whose name is Steve, if we had named him Matthew, how would you have all reacted to that? Would any of you think that was... and if I told you that the longer the child who died lived, the more likely we were to name the next one of the same sex after him. Would that make anybody uneasy? Why? Yeah, but why? Okay. Is it partly that you think each child's unique? They didn't think that. What they were doing was aiming to reproduce the family line and plant it on the landscape. So that in the dream of a patriarch of Jacob, bring every child around him. And thank God for the blessing. Okay, we don't have too much time left, so let me just say that the problem is that for all the ideals of hierarchy and authority and collectivity and family and patriarchy, Concord was nowhere near living up to them. In fact, he was being torn apart in one sphere of life after another. Patriarchs were running out of land. It wasn't enough to provide for all children. They would have to move away, first up the cattle trails into northern Middlesex County, then into New Hampshire, some as far away as Vermont, others down east to Maine. And as they moved away, the sons, the delicate arrangements governing families became ever more fraught, ever more conflicted. And you find that young people are no longer willing to wait to marry. Instead, you see a rising rate of premarital pregnancies. So that on the eve of the American Revolution, 1760s to 1775, something like 40% of all first births had been conceived before the marriage. Now, how do I know this? People did not write down in their diaries, another unwanted pregnancy. It was rather that made up forms writing down when couples married and when all their children came. So you go to weddings, or once went to weddings, and you ever hear that the couple had a baby and you're thinking to yourself, gee, that seems soon since the wedding. When did we go? Anybody come back on their fingers? What you do as gossip, I do for a living as a historian. So I systematically gathered the data and brought it all together to produce rows of tables on rates of premarital conception. The couples married. Fathers didn't have to use the shotgun. In fact, they had to put the shotgun down and let them go so they could set up on their own. So, patriarchy is falling apart. Landlessness leads to growing inequality. The pressure on land leads to growing landlessness and inequality. Meanwhile, and this will be my last example here, you know too well in Carlisle the friction and conflict that were created by people moving far from the town center to create new hamlets of their own, and fighting with one another about why we have to pay taxes for a minister that we can't go to hear on the Sabbath. Why do we pay for schools that our kids can't attend when the bridges are washed out? The conflict that starts in 1732 with efforts to separate the north part of Concord into a district or precinct or town of its own, that continues for 4+ decades. And it makes every town meeting in which the issues on the warrant full of the very conflict people say they don't want. What I'm suggesting here is that Concord is, in fact, falling away from its ancestral ideals of authority, consensus, and peace, and is being torn up by conflict among neighbors. So much so that in the church, when members refused to allow Dr. Joseph Lee, the richest landholder in town, to become a member, his supporters withdraw, call themselves the Aggrieved Brethren, and you can't meet again as a church for communion. So Concord is having ever more conflict. And at exactly that moment, what does the Massachusetts Government Act do? It takes away nearly the last bits of local autonomy. It takes away the means of people to regulate their own lives and puts them in the hands of distant others who you can only suspect of wanting to take your money, take your lives, reduce you to slavery. I'm arguing in the Minutemen and Their World that that conflict over local autonomy is the key to the American Revolution in Massachusetts. And it's in that setting that the Massachusetts towns call for a provincial congress, which met Concord October 11th, 1774, to organize a resistance. They weren't yet saying they wanted independence. They were saying only that they wanted a restoration of the charter. But in so doing, they acted out independence while still saying they were loyal to George III. So we have a curious thing here. I'm thinking of now putting together a new book project, which I think I would call Massachusetts 1774-1775, the first year of American independence. How did that happen? One thing we can say is the people in the townships, threatened by a loss of autonomy, are in fact forced to get together and plan beyond the township for a collective response to British power. And in so doing, maybe they prepare the way for themselves to go from charter rights invoking the ancestors to the universal rights that Jefferson built into the Declaration of Independence. A revolution for rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness might be a more future-looking one, however ill-achieved, than a revolution in the name of the ancestors. So I think I talked long enough. Thank you. Sure, glad to. Yeah.
It seems like religion is a current here that flows through Massachusetts in a way that's different from Connecticut or New York. The church recently engaged in a lawsuit
Yeah, I think so. A key is that Massachusetts establishes congregational autonomy. Connecticut did, but then it abridged it. And in the middle colonies and then in the south, you've got established Church of England parishes. And so, in effect, the congregational model provides the forum for ministers to preach against British policy. So Peter Oliver, the last lieutenant, I think he was Attorney General or Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, blasts the ministers as the black regiment of clergy who stirred up revolution. But on the other hand, towns could be slow to rebel and join the resistance if they had a loyalist minister or would-be loyalist minister. You can see that in, I think in Westford, in Littleton, certainly in Weston, Mass. And when the ministers are loyalists, like the great men of the town who would be loyalists, they can do many, not just town committees to slow things down. You can slow things down as well in Sabbath worship. And so but Concord and Lexington are interesting in this regard. Jonas Clark, the minister in Lexington, had no opposition, and he dominated that pulpit for a very long time. And the passage I read to you from the Lexington town resolutions, Jonas Clark probably wrote them. In Concord, William Emerson, Waldo's grandfather, was the minister. Both of them were not big New Light evangelists. They tended to be somewhere between, intense evangelists of the Great Awakening and Unitarians. They'd be somewhere Orthodox, but putting some greater emphasis on the right, on people's capacity to do something to bring about their own salvation. But crucially, who better than ministers to invoke the legacy of the founders? So Concord had a long history that as soon as you're going to do this, you start with Peter Buckley, the founding minister of Concord, who you may not know in his book of sermons that he published, is the first person to refer in print and invoke the settlement of Massachusetts Bay as a city on a hill. I mean, it's a biblical passage, but used with reference to Concord in Massachusetts. So you get that tradition built in, and the churches keep it going. Yeah.
You painted a picture of a patriarchal world in crisis. I wonder if you could tell us how that contrasted or was the same with Boston, areas closer to Boston. Was this a world phenomenon, or was this also the case in cities where land was not so much the issue?
Really good question. Really good question. I wish I'd thought of that. And perfectly, because the economy is dependent on all the seaports. And I gave a talk earlier this year in Salem for Essex County Group, and someone came up and said, "You know why Gloucester and Marblehead rebelled?" And I looked a little blank. The Fisheries Act. Nobody talks about the Fisheries Act. And, cod is king in that part of the world. So likewise, the seaports. I think that clearly the passage of land would not be so crucial. More important in Boston was two things. First, the integration of Boston within the British North Atlantic trading world, which left the port subject to the ups and downs of the business cycle, and the fact that in the late 1760s, early 1770s, the economy was in a real recession. Secondly, Boston was not growing. It was stagnant. It was, in fact, its dominance in the economy of Massachusetts was, in fact, being challenged by other North Shore ports and by Salem. But that said, some of the strongest language about the ancestors and their heritage and the duty to be loyal and carry it out was written in the Suffolk Resolves by Dr. Joseph Warren of Boston and Charlestown. So the language clearly took on a life of its own. Wasn't necessarily tied to farmers passing on land. What I think I would want to say is that my argument is not so much causal, pressure on land, loss of ancestry, appeal to the ancestors politically. I think what I want to say is that how interesting that they talk about inheritance and lay such emphasis on it in a world where inheritance is becoming ever more problematic. They were made sensitive to this issue by the social processes, economic changes that they couldn't stop because they were built into the way of life. Which means that the way of life also meant forever outward pressure on lands that might be claimed by native peoples. Not that the revolution in Massachusetts was propelled by land grabs, but elsewhere in the colonies, there certainly were big pressures towards that. Any last question? Want to know more stories about which families had premarital pregnancies? You can bring them up at the unacknowledged daughters of the American Revolution. Yeah.
Well, I was just wondering if you see parallel, think about parallels today when you're talking about people feeling inheritance and challenge and children not following the patriarch. And then there's this appeal to the popular sentiment. Do you see any parallels?
I was hoping you would all hear them. Yes, I think, it's extraordinary. First, how do people react to social change? Social changes, they're not, maybe in part brought from the outside, but come as much from their own way of life. Was the recent election a rebellion of the patriarchy or a rebellion of the irresponsible patriarchy? That people want to feel some control over their circumstances in life. Or if they welcome change, is that because they are on more secure ground than their neighbors? What happens when you have a set idea as parents of a way of life to which you want to raise your children, and you feel like they're being taken away from you by forces from the outside? Are you prone then to think that there's conspiracies that are doing this? People who are happy in their circumstances in life and not cynically exploiting other people's uncertain circumstances generally don't look to conspiracy theories. People who feel out of control are likely to imagine that they did something, that they say and they did. And they conspired. And so there were times I've thought about the people of Concord that in their rebellion, was Britain the equivalent of Salem witchcraft? In which, again, you mobilize a community against seeming outsiders so that you can stop this conspiracy? however unjust and wrong, you're pinning the blame. So, yeah, I think the American Revolution has much to give us pause. I was thinking today as I was looking over my book and preparing this, that the moderates, the people, few who become loyalists, didn't really get a fair shake to make their argument. This is not a world that was famous for cultivation of dissenting speech. And then I thought, what I just described to you is the political culture that frowned on competition and conflict and did not like to air differences. Was that political culture partly why some future loyalists would have no room to make their case? You know, you read, your eyes can glaze over, you read, oh, and this person was customs commissioner, was inspector, was tarred and feathered. And it sounds vaguely weird, and then pause and think about the injuries to your skin and the lack of medication that could help you if you got an infection from the wounds that was imposed. I mean, that was incredibly cruel and unusual punishment against dissenters. Justified in the name, now that you got me going with that question, that people who wouldn't join the boycott of British goods were enemies of the country. I think we've heard too much of that rhetoric. So I think that we should commemorate the American Revolution, but we should maybe be thoughtful in our celebration.
So many parallels that you can think of from what we've been hearing with things that are afoot today. It shows that the world doesn't change that much from year to year. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
I'll be happy to sign books if
So
we like.
we do have both of Bob's books back here, the Minutemen